By mid-1943, Rabaul rose over the Solomon Sea like a black, smoldering citadel carved from the bones of the earth itself. The volcanic ridges of the Gazelle Peninsula towered above the harbor, their flanks cut open by tunnels wide enough to swallow regiments. Beneath the constant veil of sulfur haze, the fortress pulsed with life, engines rumbling in underground chambers, Zero fighters streaking from camouflaged runways, and thousands of soldiers moving through steaming corridors gouged deep into the mountain. Heat shimmered over the bay, mixing with the chemical scent of aviation fuel and the metallic taste of ash drifting from distant vents. The entire landscape looked less like a military base and more like a living creature that breathed fire and exhaled war. American reconnaissance pilots returning from long flights brought back the same images again and again. Endless belts of anti-aircraft guns lining the ridges, concrete revetments rising overnight, new airstrips expanding across the lava plain like scars. The Japanese had woven their garrison, 110,000 strong, into the terrain so completely that even the jungle seemed enlisted in the defense. Coconut palms hid fuel tanks, vines covered artillery pits, and the humid shadows concealed networks of caves that no bomb could penetrate. Every attempt to strike at the fortress, whether by low-flying B-25s or high-altitude bombers, produced the same grim result. Burning aircraft spiraling into the sea, broken formations limping back to New Guinea, and another set of photographs showing the damage already repaired. The memory of recent campaigns magnified the dread surrounding Rabaul. Buna, Gona, Salamaua, Munda, each had been small, isolated positions compared to this volcanic behemoth, yet each demanded weeks of jungle fighting, thousands of casualties, and entire battalions wasted to disease. If such minor outposts had drained Allied strength so brutally, what fate awaited any force ordered to claw its way into Rabaul's lava fortifications? Estimates circulated quietly among staff officers. Tens of thousands killed before the first month, entire divisions consumed before reaching the inner line of tunnels, a campaign measured not in miles gained, but in lives extinguished against stone. Maps spread across command tables in Port Moresby and Brisbane showed the same horrifying pattern. Red circles overlapped across the peninsula, marking gun emplacements, fuel stores, barracks, radar stations, submarine pens, and choke points so dense they seemed to form a single solid mass of Japanese firepower. Air patrols watched convoys pour into the harbor unchallenged, each one adding more men, more ammunition, more resolve. Rabaul did not weaken under pressure, it hardened. Within Allied headquarters, the atmosphere grew heavy with the same realization whispered in different rooms by different officers. The Pacific War had reached a place where standard doctrine collided with arithmetic, and the arithmetic was merciless. Storming Rabaul would not simply be costly, it would break any army that attempted it. And yet, as the fortress expanded and the casualty projections rose, a strange undercurrent began to stir beneath the surface of Allied planning, a quiet question that no one dared voice aloud, but which hovered at the edge of every discussion. What if the world's most impregnable stronghold never needed to be taken at all?
The campaign against Rabaul shifted into the sky long before any commander dared imagine setting foot on its black volcanic slopes. Beginning in early 1943, day after day, the 5th Air Force hurled formations of B-25s, B-24s, and A-20s toward the smoking ridges of the Gazelle Peninsula, their engines shaking the morning air over New Guinea as ground crews tightened straps, checked bomb racks, and listened to the distant thunder of departing waves. The first minutes of these missions were often calm, sunlight sliding across aluminum fuselages, the ocean glittering below. But as aircraft neared the fortress, the world turned violent. Clouds thick with volcanic ash obscured the approaches. Winds sheared across the caldera, and from the hidden galleries of Rabaul's defenses rose curtains of anti-aircraft fire so dense they seemed to form a physical barrier in the sky. Bombers seldom broke formation cleanly. As they crossed the coastline, flak burst around them in black blossoms, rattling metal frames and shredding control surfaces. Pilots watched fellow crews vanish into explosions or plunge flaming into the harbor, where Japanese rescue boats circled not with mercy, but with nets to salvage the wreckage. Even when a formation reached its target, an airstrip gouged into the lava plain or a fuel depot wedged between ridges, their bombs fell through smoke into a fortress that absorbed punishment with alarming indifference. By nightfall, reconnaissance planes would return with photographs showing bulldozers and hundreds of laborers already rebuilding, filling craters, hauling wreckage aside, and rolling new drums of fuel beneath leafy camouflage that hid them from the next wave. Japanese defenses adapted faster than Allied tactics. Camouflaged revetments appeared along ravines where aircraft could shelter unseen. Tunnels were drilled into cliffs where entire squadrons could hide from bombardment. New radar stations emerged like metallic eyes on the ridgelines. Every plane lost in an American raid seemed to strengthen the fortress further, giving defenders more time, more confidence, more proof that Rabaul could endure anything. The 5th Air Force altered altitudes, approaches, and formations, but each adjustment only revealed another layer of anti-aircraft batteries or another cleverly disguised airfield carved from the jungle. Nor were the dangers limited to enemy fire. The Pacific's shifting weather transformed flight paths into corridors of turbulence, with sudden storms slamming into returning aircraft already crippled from battle. Many planes never reached their bases, slipping beneath the waves without witnesses. The air crews who survived spoke of a persistent dread. No matter how many sorties were flown, the fortress remained untouched at its core, a volcanic heart protected by rings of steel and stone. Weeks stretched into months. The tally of expended bomb tonnage rose to staggering heights, yet the results remained nearly invisible. Singed runways that reappeared overnight, damaged facilities that reemerged stronger, and an enemy whose resolve hardened each time they repelled another attack. Behind closed doors in Allied headquarters, officers studied the reports and spoke in muted tones of diminishing returns. The sky had become a graveyard of American metal, and the fortress loomed unchanged. And as the year of failed attempts drew to its bleak midpoint, a single, unavoidable question began to echo across planning rooms from New Guinea to Brisbane. If the air could not break Rabaul, then what force on earth possibly could? In Washington, far from the stifling jungles and volcanic fumes of the South Pacific, the war against Rabaul existed not in smoke and fire, but in the sterile glow of strategy rooms lined with maps, red markers, and neat stacks of casualty projections. Inside the War Department, the atmosphere carried a tension as heavy as any battlefield fog. Staff officers moved between long tables under the muted hum of electric fans, sliding reports toward senior commanders who studied them with grave, exhausted eyes. Every document spoke the same language: numbers, raw, unforgiving, indifferent. Numbers that forecast the human cost of storming the most fortified position Japan had ever built. Charts pinned across the walls showed concentric defensive rings around the Gazelle Peninsula, layered like geological strata. Intelligence summaries revealed fresh troop movements, infantry brigades pulled from Manchuria, artillery regiments redeployed from the home islands, elite air groups flown in to replace battered squadrons. Supply convoys slipped into Simpson Harbor under cover of darkness, reinforcing a garrison that already outnumbered anything the Allies could land. If New Guinea had been a slow grind, Rabaul promised to be an avalanche, one triggered the instant an American landing craft touched the black volcanic shore. Medical reports from the recent New Guinea campaigns arrived in thick envelopes stained by humidity. They detailed soldiers collapsing in swampy ravines long before they saw combat, staggering through malarial fevers that killed more reliably than bullets. Surgeons described operating in tent hospitals where rain tapped ceaselessly against canvas roofs while they fought to save intestines shredded by tropical ulcer. Quartermasters reported enormous shortages of quinine, plasma, and transport planes, supplies that would be devoured within days during an assault on Rabaul. One projection estimated that for every soldier felled by enemy fire, 2 more would fall to disease in the first month alone. War planners gathered around a large relief model of the Gazelle Peninsula, its jagged contours lit from beneath like a restless volcano. They ran simulations using tiny markers representing Marine and Army divisions moving against ridges bristling with bunkers. The results, whether optimistic or conservative, converged on a single conclusion. An assault on Rabaul would be an operation of annihilation. Entire regiments might disappear between the steep slopes and hidden cave networks before reaching the first airstrip. Casualty curves rose in arcs so steep they resembled cliffs. The logistical estimates were no less bleak. The fleet would require months to assemble the bombardment force, hundreds of ships shielding hundreds more, all concentrated in waters shadowed by land-based Japanese aircraft. Even success inland would trap American units inside a cauldron of fire and mud, dependent on fragile supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. The manpower commitments alone threatened to disrupt every other Pacific campaign. No matter how the numbers were manipulated, the equation refused to change. To take Rabaul by direct assault was to mortgage the next year of the war, perhaps the war itself. As the projections circulated through War Department corridors, silence began to replace arguments. Officers who once advocated aggressive offensives now stared at maps with the uneasy calm of men confronting a truth they had attempted to ignore. Rabaul, the fortress that Japan had crowned with concrete and lava rock, could absorb divisions like a sponge soaking blood. The air campaign had failed to soften it. The ground projections were catastrophic, and the Pacific War could not afford a disaster on that scale. Thus, in the quiet between briefings, a different kind of thought began to settle into the minds of planners. If taking Rabaul meant breaking the Allied momentum, then the traditional path, direct assault, might no longer be the only path. There had to be another way, something older than doctrine yet newly urgent, a possibility that had lingered for years in the background of Marine theoretical writings. And as new reports arrived from the front line, each redacted line, each rising casualty graph, another realization crept into the margins of Allied planning, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. Perhaps the cost of capturing Rabaul was so high that the only true victory lay in never attacking it at all. The shift began not with a declaration, but with a murmur. An idea so unfashionable that for years it had survived only in dusty Marine Corps manuals and the footnotes of forgotten planners. Bypassing an enemy stronghold had once been an academic theory, a notion penned by Earl Hancock Ellis and refined by Raymond Rogers, men who had studied the labyrinth of Pacific archipelagos long before war turned their predictions into living geography. By 1943, their writings seemed like relics of another era, overshadowed by grand offensives and the brutal arithmetic of island assaults. Yet, as intelligence reports from Rabaul grew more dire and casualty estimates climbed toward unthinkable totals, those old theories resurfaced with unexpected urgency. Inside Allied headquarters in Brisbane, tables overflowed with maps layered like geological deposits, routes, supply lines, reconnaissance sketches, and Japanese defensive grids. Officers circled them with the unhurried tension of men walking the perimeter of a minefield. Rumors drifted through adjacent rooms. Someone had rediscovered the Ellis papers. Someone else had calculated that isolating Rabaul required only airfields within striking distance, not a landing force. Someone had whispered that the fortress might be defeated without ever being touched. The idea spread quietly at first, slipping through conversations like a forbidden hope. General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force was among the first to articulate it aloud. Brutally pragmatic, hardened by months of failed bombing runs, he argued that destruction was unnecessary when starvation could achieve the same end.
"Cut the arteries," he said in one closed meeting, "and the heart stops beating on its own." His view clashed with traditional military doctrine that demanded decisive assaults, and it collided even more fiercely with General Douglas MacArthur's belief that Rabaul must be taken to clear the path to the Philippines. MacArthur saw the bypass concept as an affront to his long-term vision of the war, even as the data piling on the briefing table began to undermine that vision. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, sharp-tongued and unyielding, added an entirely different pressure. The Navy could not afford to lose carriers and cruisers in a frontal assault against land-based Japanese air power. Even victory would bleed the fleet at a moment when it faced expanding commitments across the Central Pacific. King's warnings hung in the air like cold metal. Rabaul was a maw that would devour ships the way Guadalcanal had devoured men. Against these voices stood George Marshall, the quiet architect of America's global strategy. Marshall's logic was neither dramatic nor emotional. It was arithmetic forged in the ruin of Europe. He looked at projections, he looked at timetables, he looked at the blood price attached to every plan, and slowly, inevitably, his reasoning aligned with the once dismissed concept of bypass. Why storm a fortress built to withstand annihilation when one could erase its relevance instead? The debates grew sharper. Tempers rose behind closed doors. Maps were rolled and unrolled with the impatience of officers who knew the wrong decision could cripple the war's momentum. The idea of bypassing Rabaul was no longer an academic relic. It was becoming a path to survival. The turning point came in August 1943, far from the sweltering jungles and the roar of engines, in a conference room in Quebec during the Allied meeting known as Quadrant. Here, surrounded by polished wood, cigarette smoke, and the subdued clatter of typewriters, political leaders and military commanders weighed the Pacific's future. The room hummed with the disciplined tension of global strategy. Between charts and briefings, the Allied High Command quietly executed a revolution. The planned assault on Rabaul was abandoned. No trumpet announced the decision, no communiqué celebrated it, but every officer present understood the magnitude of what had occurred. A fortress built to withstand 1,000,000 shells would not face a single American landing craft. The most powerful base in the Japanese Outer Empire would be defeated not by fire and steel, but by a deliberate act of refusal. And as the ink dried on the new directives, a single question ignited across the Pacific theater. If Rabaul would not be attacked, then how exactly would the Allies prove that a bypassed fortress could still be brought to its knees?
When the new strategy finally reached the front, it did not arrive with fanfare or proclamations. It took shape quietly, almost deceptively, in the humid dawn mist above Bougainville, where Marines stepped from landing craft into black volcanic sand, not to storm Rabaul, but to build the airfields that would suffocate it. The jungle around Cape Torquena steamed under the rising sun, its silence broken only by sporadic machine gun fire and the thud of men sinking into swamps that smelled of rotting leaves and gun oil. Bulldozers churned forward through the undergrowth like mechanical beasts, their blades pushing aside tangled roots and matted vines to clear space for runways that would one day reach farther than any artillery barrage. From these new footholds, the fortress began to feel the first grip of the noose. Long-range fighters rose with the morning winds, their shadows racing across the surf as they climbed toward the horizon, where Rabaul's volcanic peaks loomed like dark teeth biting into the sky. The air campaign no longer aimed to crack the fortress open. Its purpose now was to choke it, strike its air power, isolate its supply lines, and strip away its ability to respond. The defining moment came on November 5, 1943, when carriers of the U.S. Fifth Fleet crept into position under a storm-rippled sky. The sea rolled in heavy swells, the decks slick with spray, their metal surfaces vibrating with pent-up energy. Before dawn, flight crews moved with swift, disciplined motions, securing torpedoes beneath Avengers, checking the dive brakes of Dauntlesses, and wiping condensation from the canopies of Hellcats. The ship's lights dimmed. Engines coughed to life. A low tremor built across the decks as squadrons surged toward the catapults. Then, with the first sliver of sun, the strike launched. The sky over Rabaul erupted in a torrent of incoming aircraft. Hellcats dove through storm clouds like sharpened spears, their wings slicing the air, while Dauntlesses plunged in near-vertical drops toward cruisers anchored in Simpson Harbor. Explosions rippled across the water as torpedoes found their marks, sending columns of steam and flame skyward. Black smoke billowed from punctured hulls. Japanese sailors scrambled across slanted decks, shouting orders that vanished beneath the roar of American engines. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from a dozen ridgelines, throwing red-hot tracers into a sky now packed with fighters weaving through bursts of shrapnel. For the first time, Rabaul trembled. Cruisers Miyoko and Haguro staggered under repeated hits, their metal skins peeling away in molten fragments. The heavy cruiser Takao listed as bombs struck her bow. Smoke swallowed the harbor, drifting into the caldera and painting the volcanic cliffs with an oily haze. Submarines lurking near the harbor mouth reported pandemonium, ships burning, ammunition stores cooking off, and crews abandoning vessels that had turned into floating furnaces. Above it all, the new American strategy revealed its brutal elegance. There was no intention of landing troops, no plan to storm the tunnels. The goal was suffocation, and suffocation required control of the sky. As weeks passed, the pressure intensified. Fighters from Bougainville hammered supply barges trying to slip through the night. Submarines prowled the approaches, sinking every convoy that dared approach. The airfields, once bustling with Zeros, fell eerily quiet as their squadrons were shredded in the air or starved of fuel. The fortress that had repelled every direct assault now faced an enemy it could not shoot back at, a strategy that targeted its lifelines rather than its walls. Japanese commanders accustomed to repelling frontal attacks with fanatical resolve understood too late what was happening. The Americans had rewritten the rules. They were not coming for the fortress, they were destroying everything around it instead. Day by day, convoy by convoy, runway by runway, the mighty bastion was being turned into a sealed chamber, cut off from the empire it once protected. And as the fires of Simpson Harbor smoldered against the volcanic cliffs, one truth settled over Rabaul like the thickening haze. The fortress had begun to die, and no enemy soldier had yet set foot upon its shores. By early 1944, the once thundering heart of Rabaul beat only in shallow, uneven pulses. The airfields that had once launched waves of Zeros now lay silent beneath shifting curtains of volcanic dust. Their runways, cracked by blast craters and scarred by months of bombardment, were reduced to barren strips where abandoned aircraft sat with punctured fuel tanks and wings torn open like ribs. The turbines that once roared across the caldera now rusted in silence. The jungle, emboldened by neglect, crept back across the edges of taxiways, sending roots into the concrete as if nature itself were sealing the fortress shut. Inside the mountain tunnels, the atmosphere thickened with humidity and defeat. Lanterns flickered over the faces of soldiers who had once believed Rabaul to be the immovable shield of the Japanese Empire. Now they slept in crowded galleries where the walls dripped with condensation, where rice rations had been reduced to handfuls per day, and where the faint smell of sickness lingered in every corridor. Cases of malaria surged, dysentery spread through the ranks. Supply officers, once confident in the endless flow of ships into Simpson Harbor, now stared at empty shelves and waterlogged papers recording convoys that never arrived. Above ground, the harbor offered a vision of decay far more brutal than the bombardments. Ships listed half-sunk at their moorings, their hulls split by torpedoes, their decks charred into warped black skeletons. The water around them shimmered with oil slicks that refracted the harsh tropical sun into sickly rainbows. When the tide shifted, the groaning of warped steel echoed across the bay like the last breaths of dying beasts.
Submarines sent by the Americans patrolled the northern approaches relentlessly. Any vessel that tried to escape met a sudden, violent end beneath the waves. Barges too slow to run the blockade drifted ashore in shattered fragments. The Japanese high command inside Rabaul waited for an invasion that logic insisted must come. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka reviewed reports daily, pacing beneath maps that showed the tightening ring of Allied control. His staff refined defensive plans, updated bunker diagrams, and calculated artillery ranges. But each passing week brought no landing craft, no amphibious assault, no desperate final stand. Rumors spread quietly among the troops. The Americans were afraid. The Americans were regrouping. The Americans would strike when the rains ended. But as months turned into a year, the pattern became undeniable. The enemy had chosen not to storm the fortress at all. Isolation, not assault, had become the instrument of defeat. Rabaul was being entombed in slow motion. Without fuel, its air wings became ornaments. Without convoys, its divisions became spectators. Without reinforcements, its artillery became monuments to a war passing them by. What had been the most impregnable stronghold in the southern hemisphere transformed into a vast prison, one that contained more than 110,000 soldiers who could neither retreat nor fight. They watched the sky each morning, expecting the thunder of landing craft, but instead saw only the gray, drifting smoke of distant bombardments aimed at airfields, ports, and supply depots, never at the beaches where they waited. As 1944 bled into 1945, the fortress persisted only as the shadow of its former power. Starved of purpose, starved of supplies, even starved of the enemy it had been built to resist, Rabaul became a monument to a new kind of warfare, one where a fortress could be defeated without being taken. General staff officers who once praised its invincibility now whispered about surrender. Soldiers patrolling the cliffs could see Allied aircraft passing overhead on routes to new battles, ignoring the mighty bastion below as if it no longer mattered. And this was the final devastating truth. Rabaul no longer did matter. Its strategic value had evaporated the moment the Allies chose to bypass it. What remained was a hollow mountain filled with trapped men and abandoned guns, a citadel turned mausoleum. America had won not by breaking the fortress, but by rendering it irrelevant. A victory measured not in bodies lost, but in the lives saved by refusing to pay the price the enemy demanded.